Hello, Houston. We are going to interrupt our ongoing efforts here because I'm slightly behind where I had intended to be at this point. We are in the midst of wrapping up our discussion of problem-solving, decision-making that spins out of it, and the logical reasoning that hopefully links the one to the other. Today, we're going to pause here for an interview with a favorite person of mine on the faculty here at the University of Houston, and you should plug her in about 2 lectures ago in terms of what we will primarily be talking about. But with me today is Professor Ann Jacobson, who I very recently discovered has an amazing appointment here at the university. She has for a long time been associated with the Department of Philosophy as a full professor, but it turns out she also has a professorship in the the Division of Electrical and Computer Engineering. So what we've got here is a specialist in both computing and philosophy, as well as electrical engineering, which I have fully never understood. So in any case, you can lead me out of the wilderness on one or another of my ineptitudes, if you would. You have tuned me into the one of several blogs that you monitor, and it is fascinating to see the level of conversation that goes on in those blogs. But the reason I particularly wanted to invite you over here was because of your particular passion for Kahneman and Tversky, investigators that I also happen to have a fond bias for. And the kind of far reaches implied by your blog in terms of where all we go. But we can follow that through several different questions here. What I'd like to lead off with is kind of an open-ended question on what your overall evaluation would be of the reaction of the community of classic philosophers and logicians to the work that Kahneman and Tversky started.
Well, I think, first of all, let me thank you for your kind introduction, and you're one of my favorite people too, so...
okay, cut the camera. We're going to do some other things.
I'm sorry to say that I think the community of classical philosophers still is lagging about 20 years behind. When Kahneman and Tversky started, they started really looking at biases and heuristics in our thinking. And one of the interesting things is, if you just introspect, and professional philosophers do a lot of introspecting, then the thought that you catch, particularly if you're a highly trained professional philosopher, tends to be very logical. And a lot of people believe that Freud taught us that there's non-logical emotional stuff, but of course, if you're a professional philosopher, you're thinking about things where the emotions don't get engaged. You can look at how you think about it. It's very logical. Therefore, Kahneman and Tversky are wrong. And there, as we talk today, we might talk about some of the larger elements of what they were looking at. For example, timing. I don't think anybody in the philosophy community yet has actually caught on to the fact that human beings largely react very quickly. And the models that philosophers concocted over the centuries don't accommodate our quick reactions. So there was a lot of hostility, they're all wrong, and there's a lot that hasn't yet been accommodated.
There has, even in my own discipline, been a lot of history related to that, in that the behaviorists way back essentially created this sequential model of what happens as we talk to each other. We first listen to the words, and then we associate the meaning, we integrate the sentence structure, and then we come to an understanding of what's happened. And that would, of course, argue that when I finish talking, you then several seconds of processing, and then eventually we'll have something. And it's quite clear that when I get done, you start, and when you get done, I start.
Yes.
And so it kind of forced the parallel notion.
Yes. In fact, I'll start before you're done. No, but absolutely right. It's one of the tragedies, I think, that we find that people who can't naturally do it have a great difficulty compensating by reasoning. So, for example, some people in the autism spectrum disorder don't pick up quickly on all that's going on socially, and they often try to learn to do so, but it's very hard to reason your way into a very, very quick reaction.
What would you say are the central points that were made by Kahneman and Tversky, if you were going to list off 3 or 4?
I think, certainly the major impact of the heuristics and biases, that there are ways in which human beings, either because of our evolutionary history or because of our social placing, have employed shortcuts. We have biases in the way we perform, and that these are not things we notice ordinarily. I mean, really, people, I think, were largely unaware. And when you think about it, you think, I suddenly realized, well, goodness, that's why education takes at least 12 years. I mean, you know, and even then you get an educated doctor, and the reasoning on probability may be just as Kahneman and Tversky told us. That is, that it's full of biases and not reasoning well about probability. So that's certainly one of the major accomplishments, and that's a very multifold thing, and that's research that Kahneman is continuing. For example, when I heard him over at Rice several years ago, he was talking about biases in our reaction to medical treatment. So, for example, there's a lot of medical treatment where it's very hard to get conformity. That is, people will not keep up with it. So they were looking, and what you discover is that if something very unpleasant is occurring at the end, people will particularly dislike that. And if you follow the unpleasant part of the treatment with a pleasant part, then they're much more likely to go back to it, even though the unpleasantness is the same amount, or even if you follow it with something less unpleasant. So you have actually more unpleasantness. People will go back to it if it ends better than the unpleasant part. Now, another thing that comes out of that that's, I think, extremely important is sometimes called the dual process model of human cognition. And this is laid out in Kahneman's 2002 Nobel Prize lecture, which is available on the web at his site at Princeton University. And what the dual model of cognition gives you is, first of all, an account of how the heuristics and biases are operating to produce very rapid and fairly intuitive reactions. So a lot of our reactions are what's called in parallel. We're doing many things at once. We're considering many, many factors. We're doing it incredibly quickly. We arrive at a solution, and largely we don't know how we did it, right? Or we might have some idea of the things we were considering, but something just seems right, we're off, that's it. Then the second is our rational life. And that is, he points out, very hard, right? It's ponderous, it's slow. It's not actually what we do terribly well. And that may be why we go through this very long period of education as we practice and practice being rational. There's a recent discussion on my blog about advice to mothers, and the idea is that you give new mothers a list of rules, right? And then they can follow those rules. Well, as a matter of fact, we're naturally intuitive creatures. We're not very good at following rules. Following rules involves the ponderous cogitation that's actually quite error-prone. So I think that's really two major and complex pictures. So I would divide the major thing into two, and then there are many sub-theses under the two. One is that there are the heuristics and biases, and then an overall picture of human cognition as dual processing, very rapid and intuitive, but correctable by reason, but reason itself needing to continually correct itself.
I'm interested that you mentioned the blog. You're actually quite active of late on
yes.
several different blog-related topics. And I'm wondering if particularly if Kahneman and Tversky's work has been getting a fair hearing there. Has it impacted those efforts?
Yes. Well, the blog world is now, there are a lot of semi-professional blogs, and students are certainly welcome on, as far as I know, all of them. But there's an interesting one, Experimental Philosophy, for example, which is really interested in taking up the kinds of considerations Kahneman and Tversky have. There are blogs that tracks some of the experimental results. There's a lot going on. But one blog I run is called feministphilosophers.wordpress.com. And on that blog, I am very interested in looking at myths that we have about ourselves, one of which is this picture of ourselves as purely rational. And because I think that really gets into power relationships that end up sometimes very, very significant. If you look over the history of the way Europeans have related to people outside of Europe, the Europeans are the rational ones, everybody else is, the natives, and they're these emotional, intuitive characters. And so there's a lot there about power relations. Now, a lot of people developing this don't have that political interest. But nonetheless, since the great financial collapse, people have become more and more interested because all these financiers were supposed to be these highly rational mathematical people, and they got us into the world's biggest crisis of this century, and some people are afraid it's going to rival the crisis of the last century, the financial crisis. So how in the world did that happen? And a lot of people are turning to Kahneman and Tversky's work, and Kahneman got the 2002 Nobel Prize just for starting us off on looking at the irrational elements. Recently, though, the really quite conservative columnist for the New York Times, David Brooks, has picked up this theme. And he thinks, rightly, I think, that philosophy has lagged far behind it. The picture of reasoning that undergraduates get is often from philosophers is often inaccurate. So he wrote a column, not this last Sunday, but the Sunday before, which was April 12th. No, sorry, it wasn't April 12th. It probably was the one before that, which would be what, the 5th? Around the 5th or 6th. May have been the 6th of April. And what he or somebody at the newspaper entitled his blog "The End of Philosophy," entitled his column "The End of Philosophy," and the blogosphere exploded. And I thought what he was saying was good. And you looked at it, and you could see that people were coming on saying, "Oh, everybody understands this is really bad." So it's an interesting question whether moral reasoning is involved with pure reason, or whether it has to take account of how we are as human beings, which unfortunately is not the European ideal of the rational person. We are much more, we are all of us, European are not the natives. So I hope I'm deconstructing that term, the native. It's not one I would be fond of in normal contexts.
You brought up a subject that I wanted to get into anyway, and that is last Sunday I had the pleasure of watching Houston Grand Opera's presentation of Rigoletto. And it was one of the things that particularly caught my attention in that, in Verdi's masterpiece, was it is about a very unscrupulous and hedonistic duke who at one point in the opera is singing about during the conquest of his latest conquest of a female, he offers up the quote in song that all wisdom leads to pleasure and love, which of course may have been somewhat self-serving in that particular situation, but it does nonetheless raise the issue of emotions in cognition, to what extent they interact. I'd be interested in your kind of orientation on that particular
Well, it's really, in some ways, really difficult. Antonio Damasio starts off Descartes' Error, the book, saying, well, I was taught that emotions are very unreliable and you should really reason your way through something and keep the emotions aside, and that's how you make good decisions. And people who are alarmed at the state of marriage in the United States will often sort of urge that, well, you really need to sit down, you need to think about this. When I was at the American Philosophical Association meeting, I went to some of the sessions by the renegades who are doing the Kahneman and Tversky, and one of them John Doris, who's got an interesting book out on situationalism, that is the extent to which our reactions are not to rational principles but to situations. John was saying that the evidence is that rational deliberation screws things up. And that if you, for example, present people with two pictures and say, now you've got to make a decision and live with one of these for a year. If you push people to make the decision right away and they go off and they live with it for a year and you ask them, I can't believe it's a year, but something like that, you ask them afterwards, they're happy with their choice. But you insist that people sit and reason about it, and typically they're much less happy with their choice. And so they've looked at this. I'm not advising people to now rush off and get married to somebody who you think, wow, that's cool. But one has to be very, very careful. In a way, its emotion is maybe part of the foundation of wisdom, and an important part of the foundation of wisdom. That's in some ways what we do best. At the same time, you do want to be able to correct your emotional decisions, right? I mean, he may or she may seem like absolutely the right person, but if he's a drug addict, not a good idea to set up a family, right? This is not a stable relationship, right? You know, so I think, I believe, and many people believe, that many important things that happen are below our awareness, and that includes cognition. It's instinctive, it's emotional, it's extremely valuable, but it does have to be monitored. Yeah.
You remind me of what I think is perhaps the cruelest experiment ever done in psychology, and it was a study of the ability of a youngster, 4, 5, 6, to delay gratification. And in fact, the study featured putting a great big 3 or 4 inch wide sucker hanging on the neck of the child on a rope so that the child could in fact eat it at any given point. And the child was indicated that if they succumbed to the temptation, they would get a much smaller reward. But if in fact they could sit with it for, and I forget the length, 1 minute, 3 minutes, 5 minutes, half a day or something, they would get to keep the entire sucker as a reward. And of course the problem was it was all sugar-coated, so as soon as the child picked it up to lick it, they then lost it. The thing was removed from the child's head, and it was just a masterpiece of emotion on the part of the child, and the cognition that either had or had not reached what should have been the correct decision.
I'm just taking my students now in Intro to Cog Sci through a section on the frontal lobes, and the frontal lobes don't get fully developed until you're about your 19, 20. And that's where a lot of self-control in decision-making comes in. I look now at my attitude towards driving when I was 16, and I'm appalled. And, you know, you don't have the self-control. Oh, that would be neat. Let's stop there. You're much more a creature of impulse. And how a small child controls the impulse, that's real hard. Yes.
Well, I want to thank you for coming in today.
That's
As you can probably appreciate, we could go on for hours about anything relating to cognition or philosophy or anything in between.
You know, I was very glad to be here and very much enjoyed the talk.
Great. It was a delight to have you here.
It's good talking.
Professor Jacobson. Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, she goes off to teach another class, and I try to finish up this one. So we're going to jump back into where we were here. Again, her comments would have been most directly relevant in terms of what we're covering 2 or 3 lectures back, but we just had scheduling difficulties, among other things, the fact that she was in China when I initially invited her to come join us. So it took a little while to get her here and get everything glued together. Let's jump back in with both feet and see what we're into here. This is just a quick reminder of a screen that has way too much information on it, but let me see if I can just walk you through the main points that were being made there. This was looking at some of the impact of atmosphere on the various mental models that we've developed in the course of our considerations here. And essentially, what I was talking about was the work of Johnson Laird, which sounds like a group. It's actually an individual with a hyphenated name. And he argues in his work that decisions are essentially based on checking the conclusion against the models that have been utilized to create whatever those conclusions happen to be. And so in essence, he talks about, whoops, I jumped ahead of that before I meant to. And that is, he talks about three major themes here. One of the more fundamental forms of logic, that is that all A are B. And then when you get into the problem of what you mean by sum, you can see that we get a large number of different problems out of that. But if the example that I diagrammed over here is essentially all applicants are banana lovers, fact A. Fact B then is some banana lovers are cute. Some B are C, in other words, in terms of our formal model. And in turn then we conclude that some A are C. But it turns out not necessarily to be true, because if you look at the model that we developed here, all of the applicants to whatever we're talking about here are banana lovers, and in turn that's all they are, because it turns out there's another group that are banana lovers who happen also to be cute. But it isn't necessarily the case that because you're an applicant and because all applicants are banana lovers, that necessarily means that some banana lovers are cute, that you can therefore conclude that some of the applicants are cute. That simply doesn't follow, because in this particular diagram, I mean, that's the most dire of circumstances depicted there, but it does clearly demonstrate that there are ways in which people can become essentially active in their operations, in their application, I should say, without necessarily being cute, so to speak, or banana lovers, for that matter. The problem that I'm facing is the monitor on which the entire lecture is based has just gone entirely black. And so basically what I then wanted to talk about was the idea that we can look at the various kinds of arguments that are raised in a particular situation, one of which involves, for instance, the impact of imagery on relatedness. Those are two topics, not relatedness, but imagery certainly that we've talked about. An example of a high imagery statement would be something like, if the woman wants a new red dress, then ... And in the idea of a particular person wanting a red dress is very imagery rich, essentially. A low imagery statement might be something like, if the man reorganizes his thoughts, then ... And that's not an image that immediately creeps into your mind or springs into your mind. It would be an example of a low imagery situation or example that I've posed to you there. On the other end, we have high relatedness. That is, how does the item 1 relate to item 2? And we could take the statement that we talked about earlier. If the woman wants a new red dress, then she walks to the dress shop across the street. So in that case, the two halves of that are, first of all, high imagery, and then secondly, they also relate to the vividness of what we're talking about here. And so the two tie together very nicely. Basically, when we diagram this, when we talk about relatedness, I'm going to define it as we put on the screen here, and that is a measure of how easily or naturally two actions form any kind of a relationship, the relationship between A and B, or B and C, or A and C, depending on the various conditions that we put on it. But relatedness then becomes something that we do worry about. And so in essence, if we put all four together, the low relatedness example that I would have cited is, if the man walks his greyhound, then he gets angry about his bug bites. Well, yeah, you might get bitten if you're walking your greyhound, but in fact the two statements really just don't easily coalesce with one another. And so all four combinations are used in various kinds of combinations. Some of them, it turns out, are much more effective than others. So we can have statements that are either of low or high imagery, and in fact we can have those that are of either low or high relatedness. And it turns out that syllogisms, when we develop them, the imagery that they create and the relatedness that they display are both impactful on the ultimate effect that you'll have. So for instance, when we vary each of those factors, we get the following kind of a situation, and that is that sequences of statements that have high imagery and high relatedness, that is where the tie between the two terms is obvious, in fact, lead to much more significant successful resolution of the forms. That is, they're solved and properly analyzed in that kind of a situation. The other thing that we can also say about that is that the situations where the imagery is high and the relatedness is high are also forms of syllogisms that lead to the most graphic models. That is, it's easiest for you and I to conceptualize what we're talking about in that case. So what I'm really overlaying here on top of the formal cold hard logic that we've been talking about up to this point, and I promise not to address again, is simply the idea that how it's presented also has an impact on the believability of the argument that you ultimately offer. Not necessarily the formal logic, but certainly the believability. So then let's look at an issue like content and accuracy. What is the impact of that on the decision making that we have? Salso, in 1995, suggested some rather interesting illustrations. For instance, we argue that all men are mortal. We could say then Socrates is a man, and therefore we could conclude that Socrates is mortal. Okay, let me do that again. All men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. Now that's pretty easy. The truth value behind it is pretty straightforward, and the logic certainly is in that situation. And we have no trouble agreeing with that. In fact, we can even think very fond things about Socrates as a result of that sequence of logic. But then put in the following situation. Let's start out with an assertion like, all humans are moral. Kim Jong-il is a human. Therefore, il is moral. That's capital I, little l, in the play on words there. But if the premises are true, then the conclusion may be tough, but even though it happens to disagree with your moral attitude, your moral position on it, it doesn't deny the fact that if the initial assertion is true and the subset that you've suffered or offered is following under that general statement, then the conclusion that you ultimately reach also has to be true in that situation. So in that kind of an argument, as when arguing with a psychotic, what you want to do is to attack the initial premises. That's where the argument is going to be won or lost, not on the logic that A is B, all B are C, and therefore all A are C. So another issue that I'm kind of leading up to here is the issue of conclusions, and particularly the soundness of the argument that you offer. And what I mean by soundness is essentially a conclusion that logically follows from the premises, okay? All poisonous things are bitter. Arsenic is not bitter. Therefore, arsenic is not poisonous. Unfortunately, graduate students were asked to agree or disagree with conclusions of that type, that is derived in that A, B, C kind of logic. And then they were asked to rate their personal agreement or disagreement with each conclusion. And it turned out the soundness of the conclusions that they reached was directly driven by what their beliefs were. That is, their errors tended to reflect their bias regarding the conclusion that was reached in a logical sequence or illogical sequence as tight as the one I just started with here a minute ago. So basically their errors tend to reflect their bias regarding the particular conclusion. And it's more likely to be wrong if erroneous conclusions were consistent with their beliefs. That is, even in situations like the one I've cited there, where you might end up wanting to agree with the conclusion. In fact, it's the belief that really drives the correct application of both logic and then what we derive from it by way of conclusions. Essentially what I'm leading up to here is summarize sometimes when you argue with particular people by summarizing their views, not ours of course, but theirs, by saying essentially, my mind is made up, don't confuse me with facts. And that's a problem. When we're dealing with logic, we have to acknowledge the role that facts may play in what we're trying to argue about here. There are some other errors that can also creep in here, a couple of which you may even be guilty of. Phrases such as, and we hear it all the time, the administration, or the Democrats, or the Republicans, or Mother Nature. All of those represent essentially personification of what are essentially non-human concepts. The administration is what? It's ultimately a collection of people. But being a collection, what you get out of any administration is a kind of a compromise across all the negotiations that go on in the back rooms, in the public, and so forth and so on. People do things, not administrators. And so we really need to tie it back to the action agents in that situation. Another thing that all of us are guilty of in one way or another, in addition to the fallacy of reification, is simply what is called an ad hominem argument. Also sometimes called a poison the well argument, because that is its intent. When arch-conservative Rush Limbaugh refers to people who are advocating in behalf of our environment as the nature Nazis. He is not only well into the arena of bad taste, but he's also committing the logical fallacy of utilizing an ad hominem argument. That is, he's impeaching the people who are arguing in a particular way without necessarily addressing at all the facts or assertions that they have raised in that situation. Though I must say that I've never seen much to worry about logic in the arguments that he raises at any given time. Anyone who can follow the inauguration of President Obama with a personally expressed wish that he fail is clearly more an entertainer than a logician. And his goal ultimately is radio ratings, not anything else. So you have to kind of filter everything he does through that fundamental argument. His main goal is to remain popular, so people keep tuning into him. What you're arguing with in that case is the messenger rather than the message, and logic really forces us to look back at what's fundamentally being asserted in any given situation. And related to this is a related argument, and I couldn't figure out a specific way to label it, but it is essentially the N of one problem, another way that people will sometimes follow up logical arguments that you're having with them. And the specific example that cropped to mind was that in the developmental section of my intro Psych class, I offer up some general figures about the fact that we don't know when the first word is actually spoken. We're going to talk about that in the developmental section here in another couple of lectures. But it's around the first year of life. That's the point at which something verbally is offered, and it's very obvious to you that the child is saying what ultimately comes to be milk. And in fact, they've seen it and they want it, or you've spilled it, or something like that. But in any case, the assertion that I made was, and it's documented by data, that the first word is normally offered right around the first birthday, within a couple of months of the first birthday. And sure enough, a hand went up in the back of this large auditorium in which a woman said, essentially, "You're wrong. My daughter spoke her first word when she was 10 months old," which is fine, except that what she's basing her argument on is an N of one, and that is her daughter. It wasn't excluded by what I said simply the first word is typically spoken at whatever time I was talking about. But in essence, you need to be careful about how you justify the logic that you're using in any given situation, and aware of the problems such as reification, ad hominem approaches, and in fact fallacious logic of reaching general conclusions based on a sample of only one. In some cases, we can appeal to authority or fame in some way. Advertisers are very guilty of that. I mean, what does Tiger Woods know about Buicks, which I think was the car that he was frequently advertising for a long time, and Buick has General Motors ran into some significant difficulties, and one of the first effects of that was that Tiger Woods was no longer under contract afterwards. But we were being expected to look at a pro golfer, an exquisite pro golfer, and take his word on what would be a good car to drive. And there's really no link between golfing and car manufacturing quality at all. The same issue has visited us again here, and that is the large numbers in practice situation. I've heard ads summarized by essentially phrases like, as I'm sure you have, 1 million Americans can't be wrong. Carries essentially no logical weight at all. In fact, because A, they can be wrong, and B, sometimes they are. And simply to be right about something doesn't necessarily make the product any better or worse as a function of that agreement or disagreement. And then finally, one of my favorites, because it is so totally psychological and so totally misdirected, is the straw human argument, or the straw man argument, if you want to call it. That's the traditional name for it. What you do on any given issue is create a side issue, beat that issue to death, and clearly demonstrate its fallacy, and then expect people to generalize that argument back to whatever's the core of your particular reasoning strategy, whatever that may be. So in essence, those are some of the flaws that are built into the use of deductive reasoning. And now what I want to do in the brief time that remains here is to look at the other side of the coin, and that is what's called inductive reasoning. Remember here, based on our observations, that what we're essentially going to be doing is it's not possible to reach conclusions that can be logically derived. We are simply going to reason from the generalities, from our observations here. But our goal is to come up with a strong or a highly probable decision, not one that can necessarily logically be deduced in this situation. One of humankind's burning questions, of course, is it true blondes have more fun? And that, we've worked on that for years as fellow humans attempting to come to some kind of an answer on that. The difficulty is that we can only reason inductively here. We can infer, we can interview a lot of blondes all around the world. And we're fine if there is some consistency in that argument, if we ultimately come to find only the blondes only report fun, whatever that may be, we're fine. The difficulty is that in inductive logic, if you find even one person who does not fit the statement, it invalidates the entire argument. Because if you say, is it true blondes have more fun, then the general statement is blondes have more fun. But if you find a blonde who did not qualify as having more fun, you've essentially invalidated the original assertion. So the argument is in some cases one of essentially assembling numbers, but the demise of that can be very abrupt and quite brief in a given situation. So what we're looking for, of course, is the goal here is to essentially come up to a strong, defensible conclusion. You start with a question. You have no premises, you have no certain observations, and therefore you cannot deduce. Instead, what you have to do is reason from those specific facts or observations to a conclusion of whatever breadth you wish to apply there to explain the broadest number of facts and observations that you can do. But let's go back and consider the power of the single case in this particular instance. And that is any product of inductive reasoning can be disproven, as I said, by one argument, one example, one counterexample that doesn't agree with whatever you've concluded. So conclusively positive statements in inductive reasoning cannot be made, because you can't ultimately prove the conclusion. Available evidence has to be marshaled in support of whatever conclusion we draw in this situation. Does that happen to remind you of any kind of strategy that we use in psychology? Because basically, it's what I've done is simply to describe statistics. We ultimately, in any given experiment, conclude that thus and so has a probability of happening by chance at the 0.05, the 0.01, whatever level we wish to utilize. We don't smartly argue that because it's at 0.001, it's somehow a stronger conclusion than one reached at 0.01, because again, it's still only a single experiment, and the odds are what we're really applying there. But the whole idea of stating a probability level is simply specifying our range of how confident are we. What is the likelihood that that could have occurred by chance, given the data that we've actually generated in our one sample at a research technique. So essentially the goal remains here, reduce uncertainty, move toward a decision that is A, correct, and B, defensible in some significant way. We summarized earlier the assertions of one theorist who argues that we might have genetic inclinations for being sensitive to certain types of schemas or decision-making strategies, or for that matter, language. Certainly we do not have inborn inferences that we've made. We don't arrive with a package of decisions already made. We do become skilled, whether as people or as scientists, in generating and testing hypotheses. That's part of what our education is about, is learning to take the available data and move beyond it to some kind of a conclusion. So through reasoning, we develop our own general understandings about our world and how it operates. We develop generalizations. Birds fly, but penguins don't. Okay? Dogs have tails, but boxers don't. So there may be exceptions. But the question is, how do we develop these generalizations? What's the structure by which, the strategy by which we do that? How do we reason inductively is kind of our remaining subject here. And what we're reaching toward is essentially achieving causal inferences. And I'm going to define a causal inference as simply how people make judgments about whether one thing or event causes another thing or event. Are they or are they not related? John Stuart Mill proposed a series of canons, some of which I'm going to burden you with here. And in essence, what Mill's canons represent is a kind of a broadly practiced principle on which we base our judgments. What are the bases on which these judgments are based? And one of the things that he cited, I gave you a definition there. Broadly practiced principles on which we base our judgments. Those are the canons that Mill is talking about. And in essence, there are several, and these will be familiar to you in all likelihood as I cite them here. But one of the things that we tend to reach for is essentially demonstrating a correlation using the method of agreement. That is, each time the event of interest occurs, we record other events that also occur at the same time. And if there's any event that always occurs when the one in which you're interested occurs, what do you conclude? This method is one that keeps Clark Kent so incredibly busy. because every time Superman appears, Clark Kent is nowhere to be seen. How actively dumb do you think Lois Lane was to have gone as many years as she did without actually reaching the fact that gee, every time Superman shows up, Clark Kent isn't here. And he's always, quotes, busy somewhere. But what's sought there is a method of agreement. When one event occurs or doesn't occur, the other one does. And eventually it becomes a causatively linked in that kind of a situation. It wasn't until she was told in Superman 3 or 4 or 5 that the world of reality was actually introduced harshly into her life. Secondly, another technique that we also tend to use is the method of difference. That is, we observe all things that occur when a given event occurs. If all of these things occur except one differs when the event of interest occurs, that event is identified as the causative one. If all of the psychology majors have to take a comprehensive exam prior to graduation, and we notice that every student who had their introductory course at the school, most of them passed. That is, among that group, most of them passed. But we noticed that all of the students for one intro psych instructor always passed that comprehensive exam. That becomes an example of a difference factor. That is, the absence of being in that person's class increases the odds somebody will fail to pass the exam. But if they've been in the class, then the conclusion inductively is that they will pass the exam. So inductive reasoning can be thought of as kind of conceptualized as hypothesis testing, which is, of course, just exactly what a scientist does. And as a basis for decision, Sternberg and, who's the other one, Shustak, came up with some rather interesting bases for confirming causality. And they argued that we confirm it in one of two ways. Either we do it with the joint presence of the possibly causable event and the expected outcome. That if the suspected causative event occurs and the outcome that we expect to happen occurs, or the joint absence of both the possibly causative event and the expected outcome, either of those is essentially disconfirming specifically in the positive instance there. In the other situation, we can disconfirm. Let me go back through that because I'm jumbling words there and I don't mean to. We can confirm in logic in either of two ways. We either notice the joint presence of a possibly causative event and the event that we're interested in, or the absence of both. Okay? That's a positive confirmation of the correlation between the two events. And we disconfirm it in the obverse, in the other two ways. And that is the presence of the causative event and the absence of the expected outcome. In that kind of disconnect, that leads to a disproof of the situation, or the absence of the possibly causal event and the absence of the expected outcome. Both of those would tend to be disconfirmations of what we're talking about there. Now let's look at the errors, one of which I seem to have stumbled into there for a minute, and that was in first of all, confirmation bias. Okay, that's a common problem that we have to work with here. All right, you're going to see a little bit of a review of some of the things we were talking about just a little earlier here, but factors A and B are correlated, which is causative. A may be causing B, B may be causing A, or in fact, both A and B may be related to a higher factor, C. You may be aware of the fact that there is a documentable negative correlation between amount of beer consumed in gallons per year and an undergraduate's grade point ratio. As the one goes up, the other comes down. Arguing in some ways, people might argue that beer drinking leads to lower grades. But all of those factors impact yet another factor, which is probably causative of both, or a result of both effects. And that is that the more time you spend beer drinking, the less time you spend studying. And what in fact may cause those lower grades is the time not spent studying. And that is aggravated by, it's facilitated by the beer drinking. But in fact, the beer drinking is not directly causative, because we might argue that talking on cell phones is negatively rated to college grades. I've not seen that study done. There are days when I'm behind a driver that I'd love to. But in essence, you're dealing essentially with a confirmation bias in that situation. We've got that same law of large numbers. as I was talking about it before, and this is an error that we sink into sometimes, but for example, greater numbers of observations do not necessarily strengthen anything but our certainty. Teachers are very guilty of this, and that is when we do course ratings in any given course, we look at the averages, sure, but we also tend to look at the ratio. What's the range from what's the high to the low of whatever rating we've gotten on a particular item? And sure enough, if there's one lemon, one person who was totally dissatisfied, and you end up with a rating way off from the rest of where the rest of the ratings are, you end up fussing about what did I do wrong with that one person, and that one negative vote in what is generally an affirmative vote may elicit vast numbers of vastly more attention than is really warranted by the one negative vote. I remember about 15 years ago, I was subscribing to an electronically submitted discussion letter among teachers. It was just teachers talking to teachers about anything teachers tend to worry about, educators in general. And the author, in April, had a really elegant editorial as part of the newsletter, which spoke to what I've just been talking about, and that is that remember when you get your course ratings, which will normally occur in late spring, be sure to look at the averages, don't get hung up on the individual student. And she ran off for several paragraphs about the lack of advisability of catering only to the one errant student in a set of ratings. Pay attention to what the average is telling you. A month later, same newsletter, same editor, on the same editorial page confessed that she had just looked at her student ratings the middle of the month, and it had one deviant student, and she had spent untold hours fretting about what she might have done. And her article went off on the things that might have been done to pull that student back, but she confessed at the end that in fact she had been in direct violation of what she had exactly been talking about the previous month, and that is that there is a danger in getting swayed by the large numbers, but there's an equally great danger in getting pulled down or away from the target by the deviant number. Now let's look at then what all this is about, and that is essentially drawing strategies. That is when you draw inferences. When you draw in inferences, are you using bottom-up strategies or are you using top-down strategies? And the answer turns out to be both. Okay? In a given situation, if you use a bottom-up strategy, what you're doing is observing examples repeatedly, and yes, you're noting the variability, but you're looking for the central tendency, whatever that may happen to be. And as the variability declines, the likelihood of defining a prototype really increases. You'll remember that we defined a prototype simply as a category, membership in which can be defined more or less precisely by a rule. Okay? And it's derived through induction by observing many examples out of which you derive the prototype. That's a bottom-up strategy. You gather the data and generate from that the overall strategy. And of course, at the other end, we've got the top-down strategy. Once a prototype or a concept is formed, we then seek replication through sampling. We try to affirm it through repeated sampling. We may identify constancies across our various category members, and we may combine concepts into categories or collapse categories as that seems may make it seem to be a more inclusive situation. But in essence, either type of reasoning is okay as a source for the inferences that you and I are constantly making. And finally then, let's look at the similarity coverage hypothesis, which was developed by Daniel Osherson and others in 1990. They made essentially two predictions about the likelihood a given event will be drawn based on specific premises. And in essence, they talked about the following, and that is that a high similarity between the premise category, the if portion of our argument here, and the conclusion category tends to encourage a conclusion to be reached. And what I'm saying by that is the logic here would be premises like fleas bite leopards. Another example would be fleas bite tigers. And out of that you conclude fleas bite lions. And that's argued as being a likely basis for decision simply because of the high similarity between the premises, that is leopards and tigers, and the subject of our conclusion, which is the lions. The other thing that is cited by these investigators is the fact that a high similarity between the premise category and the lowest level category, which includes all members of the premises, tends to alter the conclusion that we will reach. The example here is essentially fleas bite leopards, fleas bite tigers, and therefore fleas bite cats seems to be a more defensible, more logical kind of conclusion than fleas bite animals, which may or may not be true. But it's simply the similarity between leopards, tigers, and cats, which kind of increases the confidence level we have in that kind of a sequenced argument than one that goes from leopards and tigers to the entire category of the animals as a collection, I should say. Now let's take just a bit of time here to relax over this topic for a minute and look at a couple of other ways in which various people have studied this particular overall process of logical reasoning that we get. Haberland had a book published a couple of times in the 1990s, which sadly, as near as I can find, has not been republished, reoffered in a third edition. But in there, he makes a very nice distinction between solving problems that don't offer many cues and solving those that in fact do offer a lot of cues. The first group he calls basically knowledge lean problems, or you could think of them as shallow bases based on the knowledge that's involved. Solving these does not require a whole lot of what is called in this area domain knowledge, that is knowledge about the entire arena in which we're following, in which we're engaged here. You can say about them, about these kind of problems, that they first of all, they tend to be very well defined. That is, in a shallow knowledge-based situation, there's very little domain knowledge that's necessary, but the problems themselves are quite well defined. And in fact, they may be quite complex. That is, they're not always easy to solve. A classic example of this that I'm talking about here would be the Tower of Hanoi problem, as well as the related class of similar problems that actually relate to the problem you may remember of where we have three missionaries on a journey through the jungle with three cannibals. Okay, and at some point they come to a river that they have to cross with a canoe that only carry two people, and there is a logic that you have to work out where at no time does the number of cannibals outnumber the number of missionaries, or pretty soon you've lost some missionaries. So in any case, there is a set of rules that can be worked out to solve that kind of problem. And as the size of the challenge increases here, that is, as you increase the number of missionaries and cannibals from 3 to 4 to 5 and so forth, what happens is that the possible number of states, that is numbers of people on each side that you can find yourself in, goes up as the square of the number of cannibals missionaries, even though the number of possible moves need not have been impacted at all or significantly. Let's go back and look at, for instance, in the Tower of Hanoi problem that we looked at once before, and just simplify it a little bit for you in the following way. If you use the 3-peg version with only 2 coins, where the rule, as you remember, is that at no time is the B coin, that is the bottom, the bigger coin there, to be stacked on top of the other coin, and you need to move that entire pyramid from one place to another, there are a number of different states. One of the ways to do this is actually to look at all of the different possible states that can be utilized. And it turns out there are 9 different situations that can crop up in this. What I've diagrammed here is simply all of the possible arrangements of strategies, orders, ways in which the coins can be ordered in solving this problem. And it turns out you don't need to get into all of them. Okay, for instance, the number 2 thing here is not rational. It isn't necessary, because you've got to move several times to get to this position, and this one isn't necessary as a means to an end. And it turns out this one isn't either. So if we're actually trying to solve this problem, these 2 can be taken away. We can go directly from this state to this one by simply moving the upper smaller coin into the middle stake, into the next stake over. Okay, so that's one of the states that we've got among the 9 that we had here originally, representing unique combinations. This one, it turns out, also doesn't benefit us at all, because we've got to make a number of moves in order to get the pyramid over to the other side, and doing this is simply a waste of time. So in essence, we can eliminate this one. On the other hand, this is a state that is worth getting into on the way to a conclusion. So in fact, in this case, we move this item over to the far side, and this is the state that we end up with for the moment. Okay, again, it makes no particular benefit to achieve the 7th and 8th situations here, so we take those out, and in fact, from this state you can get directly to this one. Okay, So in essence, all I'm proposing here is that among all the different combinations that could be utilized, the only ones we really need are this, where we move the small one to the middle, we move the big one to the other side, and then we simply move the small one from the middle over to the other side, and we've moved the pyramid essentially from one side to the other of the situation that's involved there. So basically what's involved there is developing a heuristic search strategy. That is, we have to know how to search across all the different possible combinations to find the ones that we're really interested in. And we use, as I said before, as we've already discussed, the means end analysis in that situation. Example. We're coming to the end of the semester here, and maybe if you're living in the dorms, you want to pack up and go home. You finish your last exam, you're done, you're out of here. And you've got a problem that is subject to exactly the kind of analysis that we've just done. If you're lucky enough to have a car, then the solution occurs to you, well, I'll drive home. That's part of the battle, but the other part is, how are you going to go? What's the route you're going to take? And so ultimately what you do, move A, B, C, and so forth, is essentially driving a given direction. If the distance between where you are and where you want to be gets shorter, we keep that. That's a strategy that works. If it doesn't, if the distance is greater, go back to where you started and don't do that again. We drop that one out. And it is essentially simply a sequential problem-solving task. I can remember when I first moved into Houston some 35 years ago now, I took a much longer way to get to school, to the U of H, than I do now. Now, of course, we've integrated other highways in the system, but even so, the route that I initially chose was a lot longer than I ultimately learned to do by talking to various people and getting shorter and shorter situations. You've probably had the experience of talking to friends here about where they live and how they get to campus, and if they live anywhere near you, you may be able to make suggestions about, have you considered turning on this, that, or the other street. One of the things that I have learned, and this is off the record, don't ever tell anybody, but it turns out that when 288 was developed coming up from the South Loop, the intent of the designers was that everybody on 288 was going to go all the way up to 45, take a right, come down 45 to Cullen, and exit to the university that way. That is, they never planned to have people do what the vast majority of people coming up 288 now do from the south, which is take a right on McGregor. That was never planned. And that essentially is a rule, a sub-goal that they built for themselves that in some ways frustrates traffic flow now, because they put a plan in that was not based on a logical examination of the means end analysis in that situation. Let's go back to the overall puzzle here and show you the advantage of sub-goals. That is, instead of standing here at the university, if in fact you're trying to find out how to get to where you want to be. I really meant to put that word in later. We'll come back and talk about recursion a little bit later. But in essence, the problem that you face here in trying to move all three elements to the other side can in fact be very subdivided into another strategy. Slightly different from what I diagrammed here just a minute ago. But if you look at it, we can move this top one to the right-hand position, which is a legal move because there's nothing in the middle, so we'll just go directly from there to there. We can then move the middle one from on top of the bigger one to the middle position, and then in fact we can solve a sub-goal by simply moving this smaller one on top of the middle one. And what's happened there is a pyramid from one stake to another. And it turns out that is the only strategy that you have to solve this entire problem. Because if you look at the remaining steps, what we've developed here is essentially a pyramid sub-goal. That is, we've used the rules that were imposed on us to move a subset of the overall group from one position to another. And that, in miniature, is exactly what we're asked to do if we're trying to move this whole stack over to this pole. Okay, we've already done it with two, and we can generalize those principles, okay? And so what we're doing is using a pyramid sub-goal, and if you'll notice, the solution of the rest of the problem then simply involves taking that big position C, group C, factor C, and moving it over to the other side, putting it here. Then we're going to take this small one, we're going to move it over to the middle, we're going to take the middle-sized one, and we're going to move it over to the top of the biggest one, and in fact then we're going to take the small one and move it over to the top of the big one. So we didn't even need 9 options for solving that particular problem. But if you'll notice, the last 4 are simply a repetition of exactly the same strategy that was used in moving the first 2 objects. That's kind of a direct demonstration of what we're talking about when we talk about sub-goal analyses. That is, can you get closer to and it's another way to describe the means end analysis. What you've done is simply develop a smaller strategy involving only 2 instead of 3 to get a pyramid moved across. And then by following the same logic, you can move that other pyramid on top of the big block that you'd originally tried to by simply doing it recursively, doing it again. And that leads us to the term that I really meant to introduce only at this point, and that is recursion, which is simply the repetitive use of a given situation. And that's ultimately a fundamental illustration of the basic problem-solving strategy that you use in graphic format here. Now let's also look at some other things that are kind of interesting in terms of what they offer to us, and psychologists have studied this. Things like analogies. For instance, you've probably read about a tumor in the body, which is solved only if you can direct an intensive amount of heat at that tumor. Okay, and the problem, of course, is that if you stand outside the body of any of us with a high-power heat source, it doesn't matter how accurately you target that heat. If you've put it all through one channel, what you've done is fry a hole from the outer skin to wherever the tumor happens to be located. And the solution to that problem is actually pretty straightforward. And that is in the case that take the high-powered sources and use them to generate weaker beams only at the position where you need the heat, where that heat actually is needed. And in that case, you're doing solving. It turns out that problem is exactly analogous to a problem faced by a general who's got an army outside a country and the need to take a particular in the war. What he's got is that city is really crucial to taking the rest of the territory, but she's not ready to take his or her soldiers and fight the battle at that anywhere in the city. The question then is, how do you get to the troops? How do you get the troops to the point where the battle how do you marshal the subjects in a given situation? Okay. The given situation, and as you can appreciate, perhaps the solution to that particular problem is going to be solved in exactly the same way. That is, if you think about this as a highway and this is the place where the battle ultimately needs to be fought, as a general, all you do is to divide the troops into 4 different smaller groups who can potentially immigrate to the place where they need to be. Immigrate. I always get those mixed up. But in any case, you divide the army, feed them in from different directions. And at the ultimate, you can reduce it to troop movements of 1, and some significant number of them can infiltrate through the country and get to the place where the battle needs to be fought without ever having the army assembled until they're right at the place where the battle is needed. You can see the parallel to getting the heat to the place where it needs for destruction of the particular tissue. And in essence, what we're arguing there is the use of analogies. And in fact, analogies simply represent problems that overlap, that share significant similarities with one another in a given situation. One way to increase the impact that analogs have is to use many of them. That is one of the strategies that has been developed over the years. Practice makes perfect. So in fact, if you use a number of analogs, it increases the likelihood that people will abstract from it the relevant situation. We could go off on a whole discussion here of what if we identify with the wrong features in the analog. I won't get into that other than just kind of the general statement that if you use a lot of analogies, the impact of each of them kind of accumulates in such a way that it makes them more obvious in solving other analogies. Another thing that can be involved, another way to increase the use of information provided by analogs is simply to suggest to the person that they in fact pay attention to the similarities between the previous problem we gave you and the current one. As for instance, if we'd let you work through the how do you impact a tumor and then pose the army problem to you in that situation. Now, if we come back to our author's discussion of the knowledge-based situation, I also want to review very briefly what he calls deep knowledge or basically knowledge-rich situations. Here, the situation is quite different. That is, among other things, for instance, we have a large quantity of rules that will apply in a given situation, and in fact we have a quantity of operators that can be used to solve the problem, many different ways to solve a particular problem. Compare, for instance, the number and rules that you ultimately had to learn to add and subtract numbers. That was way back in first grade that you were worrying about that. And now it looks pretty simplistic. But if you look back on it, in fact, it was really simplistic because you're using typically only single-digit numbers and you simply have to learn the fundamental rules of adding those two numbers together or subtracting one from the other. Compare that, on the other hand, with what we face with chess. As an example, or even better, more directly relevant, is the amount of paperwork that you have to post the profit loss statement for a corporation in this country. The CPA that does that ultimately has a huge knowledge of very complex rules about how things are factored as bonuses to the company, what is a cost, how you factor them in, and so forth. Or to come back to a more simple example, look at the Tower of Hanoi, which is a fairly shallow problem ultimately. But somebody has actually proposed that problem up to 64 coins stacked on three cases, and there is, it turns out, a way to solve that theoretically, but it's never been solved. The complexity goes up geometrically in that situation. By the time you get up to 64 coins stacked on top of the stakes, it becomes a very, very complex problem. Should be talking about stakes rather than coins there, but in any case, the operations are quite simple. That is, it's simply a smaller thing cannot be on top of have a bigger thing on top of it. But compare that against what it takes to do chess, to play chess. There are just rules upon rules in terms of what can and what can't move. A limited number of operators, but a huge complexity in the possible moves that you can offer, because it goes up essentially geometrically, and you're starting with a board that is, what, 8 by 8, so there are 64 positions, and you can get any piece on almost any position eventually in a given situation. So we come back, then I just remind you about the difference between experts and novices, and I'm not going to go over all the details of that, but in essence you will remember that, for instance, when an expert looks at a game interrupted partway through or picture depicted partway through, he or she can report a significantly larger number of units of the board and larger amounts of information within each of those units. So both the number of chunks that can be recalled and the number of units within each chunk are also larger than a novice looking at that situation. And yet neither of them, the novice or the expert, can recall any more when the pieces are simply randomly distributed. So essentially the rule system that the expert uses, the expert chess player uses, is an aid to the storage and retrieval of information in that situation. If you look at that overall, what you find is that there are two different types of knowledge that are involved in the knowledge of surgeons or lawyers or CPAs or any of the highly trained specialists in a given content area within our existence here. One of them is declarative knowledge, that is what a surgeon or a lawyer or anything could write out in terms of the laws of the land or the organization of the body. And in the other case, the procedural knowledge about how to perform their career. What happens is that the procedural knowledge itself gradually tends to fade away. It becomes essentially unconscious. It becomes automated. I was trying to think of an example, and it occurred to me that when I lecture in a large class, if I have a student, as will happen occasionally, who asks a question but speaks very softly, when you're talking to a group of 400 or 500 people, it's not real helpful to have somebody halfway up on the right ask a soft question, because then you have to waste time to repeat it. What I do when that kind of a situation develops is a very simple operating rule of lecturing, and that is as the student is asking the question and I realize they're talking softly, what I do is back away from them. So essentially, though I'm still talking to them and nodding to them, encouraging the question, I'm gradually backing away to the far side of the auditorium, so that implicitly what's being told to them, what they're being forced into, is a situation where if they want me to hear, they're going to have to speak louder. And eventually, if they're over on the right side of the auditorium, you're going to find me lecturing from over by the left wall, so that they're going to have to talk loud enough to be heard by everybody between me and them in that situation. That's but one example of the kind of unconscious knowledge, essentially. I really had to think a bit to come up with that as one example. But any particular career has significant amounts of those kinds of procedural knowledge built into them. And with this, we're going to leave our logical processing of information behind and go into the area that we were waiting for at the beginning of the lecture, and that is decision making. Essentially, William James had a marvelous quote about this over 100 years ago when he opined, there is no more miserable human being than in which nothing is habitual but indecision. You and I are naturally inclined toward making decisions, and how we get about doing that is kind of what we're going to be starting to talk about today. You've faced it right from the time the alarm rang this morning. You say to yourself, there's the alarm. Should I get up yet? No. That's why radios have snooze buttons. But at some point, you decide, okay, I've got to get up. So now, should I get on my back, stick my left leg out first, or shall I be on my tummy and stick my right leg out first? Or since I'm on the other side of the bed, should I use the right leg first and then the left leg because I'm on my back, and so forth? Should I wear my slippers over to the bathroom, or shall I just bear the pressure of a cold floor? On and on and on. We make decisions all the time. What we're going to be looking at today is, this in the next lecture, is some of the logic we use in reaching those decisions. But it's by no means easy, and yet much of it has gone through the same process as the more formalized ones that we're going to actually be checking, envisioning in our discussions here forthcoming. And so in essence, what we'll do essentially is to define decision making as the generation, evaluation, and selection among relevant, sometimes uncertain, even risky choices that we generate for ourselves in a given situation. Each component that contributes to the decision is basically pertinent. We constantly face those choices, and it's easy to see such choices can generate really very complex calculational issues in terms of what we're actually looking at. We can involve things like probability. What is the likelihood that this, that, or the other thing will happen? What is the certainty with which a given event is going to, the consequence of whatever decision I've made is going to be realized? What risks will I be subject to in getting from the current state to the one I'd like to be in, or have to get to, as that may be? How much data am I going to have to assemble in order to be able to reach a particular decision, and so forth? There are a lot of different factors that go into our decision as to how to reach the decision that we're about. And one of the other things that we really have to factor in here is kind of implicit in everything that we've been talking about this semester, and that is that you and I have very fundamental limits on our ability to process information. So that in the shallow or the deep knowledge processes before, even when we had a relatively few disks that we had to worry about in the Tower of Hanoi problem, you still had to keep in mind the implication that in fact there's always a following move until you reach the conclusion. And therefore it puts some degree of load on working memory. And the larger the number of chips or the larger number of poles that you're using, the higher the load on working memory is in that kind of a situation. And that imposes a processing limit on you and I. So essentially, the limited demands on processing capacity really have to be recognized in that situation. We have to recognize the capacity, and that in turn actually forces us to address at least two different kinds of models that may be utilized in our ultimate decision making. One of them is essentially those kind of like what we've been examining over the last couple of lectures, and those are essentially those that involve cold hard logic, a rational approach to this is what we need to do. And yet, what Professor Jacobson was talking about at the beginning of the lecture bears equally well on this section of the course, and that is that oftentimes we are simply not coldly, hardly logical. We may not have the memory capacity, we may not have the inclination, and in fact what we end up doing as decision makers always, whether we use the rational approach out of comfort or not, is we try to optimize what we're doing. We try to make an optimal decision of one sort or another, that is, that maximizes, given the potential cost, what maximizes the benefits to us. In essence, Medden and Ross suggest that psychologists study sensory processes investigating things like illusions, but they view the illusions where our system simply misfires as very instructive ways to increase their understanding of perceptual systems and how they operate, but they don't use illusions as essentially evidence that the decision-making is flawed There are just limits that are built into the kind of decisions that we can make, or what we judge to happen, be it presented in front of us, based on it, in some cases, being illusionary. That is, it miscues our processing system in that case. And so likewise, as we look at our study of decision making, what we're going to do is focus on the strategies and heuristics that may in fact and sometimes fail. But in fact, that doesn't in and of itself make us bad decision makers. It just may mean that that's a strategy that we won't often tend to use. We do have shortcomings as decision makers, but it's a trainable, malleable fact. Element of us. And the phrase that I saw in one reading that I was doing suggested that you and I have what could be called predictable imperfections built into us. So we're going to kind of work around those, be able to identify them, and then work around them. Now, in fact, what we'll be doing here in general is working with what are called rational or normative models. I'm going to spend the bulk of the time on these. So what do we mean by those? Well, let's in fact define the obverse, the negative state first. And those irrational decision-making essentially involves reasoning processes which, based on the same evidence, reach contradictory conclusions. Okay? And contrast that to the definition of rationality, or a rational decision-making process, which is a process that is based on the same evidence but reaches confirmatory conclusions manifested or based on reason or logic, as I'll get to here in just a second. The thing I wanted to point out here before stating the last thing was simply that if you look at it, the two definitions are precisely identical, and the only difference there is that the one leads to rational conclusions, the other reaches irrational conclusions. And in fact, the other two ways to define rational decision-making is to think of it as manifesting or based upon reason, and finally then to look at those that we would call ultimately logical. As these goals change, the model that you and I will tend to utilize is also going to change, and that's where we'll pick it up next time, looking at expectancy value theory.